I'd like to move on now quickly to the moderated discussion part of this panel. And the way I think that I'm going to run this is I'm going to, I have a couple questions that I have on my mind. And everyone is happy to, and welcome to kind of chime in on them. But I think I'm going to focus them more on one or two panelists here. And then if others have comments, you can just grab my attention and you can kind of, if we were live, you could give me the two-finger kind of sign, but just feel free to kind of grab my attention and you can kind of chime in as well. So the first question that I have, and I think I'm going to direct this towards Bart initially. This will be looking at sort of the institutional side and especially on infrastructure. So you discussed, in a very positive light, and I think you were able to articulate this quite well about the role of the ADB and also the World Bank Group and EBRD. I fully agree that the ADB should be playing a central role as we develop our approach to infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's been underappreciated in many ways. But what other sort of, in addition to some of the things that Canada could be doing, the ADB and other countries that are members of the ADB could be doing, what other, outside of the kind of multilateral groups that you mentioned, what other ways could there be to kind of complement the ADB's work? And is there kind of space and capacity to do that? So I think a few people brought up the Blue Dot Network. Australia, US, and Japan have a trilateral infrastructure collaboration project. Are there ways that you feel that we could be better at complementing the work of the ADB?
Jonathan, thanks for the question. A couple of thoughts on that. The first is, look, Canada is a land of immigration, and I think it's becoming increasingly clear that this is a huge national asset for the country. There are some, for example, 6 million Canadians with Asian roots. Now, some, they've been here many generations, their families, others are more recently arrived. And many of them have maybe a more entrepreneurial bent, have started businesses and connected back to their homelands and regions. And I don't get the feeling that we've fully, these diaspora networks have been fully utilized, harnessed, this power of connectivity across cultures that also links into business opportunities. So that's one that comes to mind. What more can be done? And I think, if you look at the immigration trends, COVID threw everything off. But up until COVID, you had large incoming groups from the Philippines, from India. Of course, China's there too. But how can, through chambers of commerce and giving a greater attention to these groups, can we link into the countries in Asia? So that's one thought. And related to that, I'll just make one other point, is Canada, again, before COVID interrupted, continued to increase the number of foreign students in Canada. And then at the university level, many students who come, they get a degree and then they stay on for a handful of years. And many of them will then get permanent residency and stay. And they're adding to the human capital in an aging population. And they're contributing to ingenuity, creativity, well educated. And many of them are getting into the startup sectors of Toronto, Edmonton, Ottawa, Montreal, Vancouver, and elsewhere. So this is a trend we should not stop from a Canadian perspective. And at the same time in the US, again, pre-COVID and during COVID, you had more restrictions and kind of a feeling that we don't welcome students in the way that we used to, and the doormat, the door wasn't quite as open as it was in the past. This is a comparative advantage for Canada, and there's many ways from the students to immigrant populations to tap into that and connect through businesses. It is happening, of course, it's happening. But I'm just saying, what more can we do to ratchet that up? And I think this is going to be a very powerful strength of Canada.
Thanks so much, Bart. Did anybody else want to chime in on the infrastructure question? Or if you do, just wave your hand, or I can move on to my next question. Okay, Ayuka, please.
Thank you. Maybe I can add several comments around what kind of institutions we might be able to consider in terms of infrastructure financing. I think I just wanted to maybe elaborate a little bit on the roles of public and private infrastructure financing institutions that's increasingly playing a role, especially around digital connectivity. First is I think there were a lot of mentions about the trilateral US, Japan, Australia infrastructure partnership and the Blue Dot network, but I think what's really opening up opportunities is the new the US International Finance Development Corporation, which has doubled its investment cap under the BUILD Act and also allows non-US firms to provide loans to non-US firms. And this is, I think, is a very important change under the new legislation and increased capacities. And the cooperation between Japan's Bank of International Cooperation, JBIC, and is allowing a large level of financing for infrastructure. And also another aspect, so Japan has been funding a lot of projects with the United States and Australia around the undersea cables. And the recent example is Chile's decision to go with Japan's the proposal, and which includes JBIC and US DFC. But also Japan has this tool specifically focused on ICT. It's called the Japan ICT Fund, which is also a private and public investment fund for digital infrastructure, which has been playing a key role in Japan's undersea cable projects around the Indo-Pacific region. And also the recent other cases include investments in Palau's digital undersea cables in the Pacific Islands. So I think there's a lot of roles that these private and public funds can play in enhancing digital connectivity.
Jonathan, if I could just weigh in very quickly. It should be explored. And keep in mind that Canada also has a development finance institution that was set up in the last handful of years, FinDev Canada. It's much, much smaller than the DFC in the US in terms of its capitalization. It's based in Montreal, where I am. And it was set up with a focus, initially at least, on Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. And I understand the reasons that was done, and there's some good strategic reasons with limited capital. But if we are looking at these big markets in Asia, which are going to become so much more important in the next few years, should not this agency be beefed up like the DFC south of the border to help Canadian firms get into Asian markets? That would be my observation.
That's a really good point, Martin. And one thing I was going to kind of notice too, I had noticed the growing collaboration. As you said, it's still a nascent sort of institution, but I believe there's an MOU signed with DFC. And I think this is, as we continue to kind of build our approach to this region, I think they should be a key partner that we think about. You brought up a range of important kind of topics. I think undersea cables as well was something that has been discussed. Dan discussed this as well. I think this is an important element. And it's a good segue, unless anyone else has any other sort of points to talk about on the trade side, because I think some of the things that the US has been doing in infrastructure terms, which I think started under the Trump administration, but I think likely many elements will continue to be followed under the Biden administration, I think help broaden out its approach to this region. I think sometimes when the Obama administration initially came out with its pivot, it was framed as seemingly largely a security leg. But I think that we've seen increased attention towards infrastructure and other elements. So this is, I think, an important factor. Let me move on to my next kind of question, and I'm going to start, Amitendo, with you on this. And this is going to be more centered on trade. And I guess as I was mentioning the U.S., I'm going to give you the very, very difficult question and ask you, will the U.S. rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership? What do you see the prospects of that? Just because I want to be an unhelpful moderator. But before asking you that question, and others are free to chime in on that, I wanted to talk more broadly and more strategically about some of the multilateral trade agreements that are developing in the region. We touched on both the CPTPP and RCEP, but there are other more ambitious projects, FTAP and others, that have been kind of discussed over the years, in addition to the bilaterals and the Japan-ASEAN deals and other sorts of the layers of FTAs in the region. How do you see the future of this sort of trade architecture in the region? And if you could, particularly in addition to the U.S. and thinking about if they will or they won't join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, does expansion make sense? And if so, what partners does expansion of CPTPP make sense in regards to? Oh, I think you're still on mute, but maybe we can canvass if anybody else has any predictions on whether the U.S. is going to join the TPP while Amitendu figures out his mic. Anybody? Okay, Bart.
Sorry, no, it's not going to happen. The U.S. administration has made clear what its focus is on in the next couple of years, when it really has to cap the capital, and before elections of 2022 may swing the House or the Senate back in the Republican hands. And trade is not a high priority. And joining the CPTPP, it's too big a lift, given opposition on both the right and the left, the populist influences in the States. I do not see that happening. The UK will be a member of CPTPP before the US.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the Biden administration has a lot on its plate in the first couple of months, so it's going to be a challenge. I'm just going to see if I can return back to you, Amitendu, if you're able to comment. Yeah, I think unfortunately we'll have to come back to you, Amitendu, but we will have time to do that. Dan, did you have something quickly you wanted to mention on it?
Sure. While Amitendu is getting his mic in gear, the one thing which has been very prominent in the U.S. discussion has been the fear about that the decoupling is actually de-Americanizing supply chains. And I think what we have to anticipate is that the lobbying effort from U.S. industry for the U.S. to re-engage will be very powerful on the Biden administration. And personally, I would think that this is a very good thing for Canada, because we're better plugged into U.S. supply chain and can access the dynamic Asian markets through the U.S. more easily probably than we can directly. So I would just watch for that.
Okay, great. Amitendu.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. So Asia comes back. No, thank you, Jonathan. I was just trying to compliment you on bringing to the table a question which is really preoccupying the minds of a large number of people, not just in the region, but across the world, as I can see from the emphasis that you put to it. Look, I think let's look at it this way. We know that Mr. Biden personally and the Obama administration was exceptionally hardly committed to the TPPP, which it crafted during its time. But it was primarily looked at as an Asia-Pacific trade agreement. And for a large number of people in the region, the TPP was actually the stepping stone to an Asia-Pacific free trade agreement. Today, the context has changed somewhat. And that is primarily because not just the US moved out of the TPP, but also because in the meantime, the United States commitment and a large part of the regional commitment to the idea of Indo-Pacific has gained a lot of traction. I think a very central question to be looked at in that regard is that in terms of the Biden administration, how much is the resource that is willing to be committed to the idea of Indo-Pacific? Today, if the idea of Indo-Pacific supersedes that of the Asia-Pacific construct, I'm not entirely sure whether the US would want to come back to the CPTPP. Because I think the CPTPP by itself still remains primarily an Asia-Pacific trade construct. And today, there are other attendant complications that have come in. Firstly, China wants to join the CPTPP, which I think is a clever strategic move that China has played. And let's not forget that there is already a US-China trade deal which is in operation. That deal hasn't been taken away. Now, from a United States perspective, what are the benefits of getting into the CPTPP if it is not being positioned as an alliance to balance China? This is an important question which I think needs to be taken note of, because otherwise today, by and large, you have a real possibility if China joins the CPTPP, the RCEP and the CPTPP coming far closer to each other than we visualized it would earlier, because the memberships are going to very significantly overlap. In that case, for the United States, it's going to be a difficult choice. It's going to be an exceptionally difficult choice for India, because India is going to be the only important Indo-Pacific actor which will be left out of all formal trade constructs that are shaping up in Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific. In a sense, I think a country like India will be happy if the United States delays its decision on the CPTPP. And in the sense, it will give it more time to ponder, look at the ramifications, look at the implications. When it comes to the regional perspective, the ASEAN perspective, the broader Asia perspective, I think they will be happy to see the United States and China together in a trade agreement, because that trade agreement will be confidence inspiring. And the atmosphere in the region has been very heavily vitiated over the last 1 to 2 years, over this, major friction that has broken out between the United States and China, because that's really economically affected Southeast Asia and a large number of other countries. But the point to be noted, Jonathan, is that, all these are afterthoughts. A lot has actually happened in the meantime. And I think this is where I want to come back to a point that Bert raised. I think we need to look very closely back at multilateralism. We need to look very closely back at the role that institutes like the ADB can play because of their politically neutral character. And same of the WTO. Well, I often hear this, that the WTO is bad, but I haven't got an answer in terms of what is better than the WTO. And when it comes to the ADB, let me give you a very simple example of what I say. You know that India and China have had a very ugly period of bilateral relations, leading India to suspend a large number of Chinese investments into India. About a month ago, India actually allowed a Chinese vendor investment in a road infrastructure project in India. And this was just because this was a project that was called out by the ADB. And the ADB project requires participation across nationalities, across countries. And when it is an ADB project, there is no concern. There is no concern with respect to what the country participation in that project is and how that can be utilized. A concern which I'm afraid continues to remain with the AIIB, continues to remain in a fairly substantive way, because there's always this view. India has held this view that, look, we are the largest shareholder, but China is the largest. And today you have a situation where there's a great amount of mistrust permeated in the region. And while countries are talking about working together, building collectives, so on and so forth, there needs to be a brand, there needs to be labels which inspire that confidence. And I think we really need to go back to the institutions which have pioneered that collectivity, WTO, ADB, APEC, to a very large extent, which came out of non-political neutral assignments. I'm not saying that you do away with Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific remains solid, but Indo-Pacific has to grow out of a largely security-shaped idea and construct.
Well, thanks, Amitendra. I think that's actually a really great segue to, I think, what'll make our last discussion, the moderated discussion, and then we'll kind of move in, because I really do want to get a chance to see and to provide some of the questions that our audience has. They had a number of interesting questions on this topic. But I think I did want to finalize the moderated discussion with a talk on security, because I think you really sort of crystallized that point there, that I think that many states, I think, are, when they're thinking about this region, I think Canada included, they see a host of different security tripwires, whether it's the Korean Peninsula, whether it's what's happening in the maritime domain in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, with regard to Taiwan. Obviously, Amitendra, you referenced what's happening between China and India, not to mention the persistent tensions between India and Pakistan. So there's a lot going on, obviously, from the security side. In addition to some of this, the worries about infrastructure as a part of the Belt and Road Initiative from China. So I guess my question would be, how do states sort of balance when they're developing these, Indo-Pacific concepts, Indo-Pacific approaches, looking for cooperation? How do they find the resources, the capital, and sort of that political attention to the economic and infrastructure trade side? It's no longer possible to sort of dissect these. I know people used to like to kind of bifurcate, economy, trade, and security, and say they're different baskets. I think we all know that that's no longer possible, and that they intersect quite closely. But how are we going to be able to kind of pursue some of these initiatives at the same time with these real principal and potential simmering security challenges in the region? So maybe I'll turn to Yuka first to see if she can kind of give me a perspective.
Right, thank you. That's a very important topic and important discussion actually around the free and open Indo-Pacific concept itself as well. I think one of the things that's often misunderstood about Japan's approach to Indo-Pacific is that because the idea of the security diamond that was proposed by Prime Minister Abe in his first term in 2007, the notion of the security, the ties of this Indo-Pacific security, was so strong that his new kind of diplomatic vision of free and open Indo-Pacific was also seen as more of a security construct. And I think another factor was that the Trump administration's national security strategy and also the DoD's defense strategy also used the term free and open Indo-Pacific, and that also gave more kind of security element to this construct. But if you actually look at what kind of things have emerged out of this free and open Indo-Pacific, it's really the economic dimension. I think some of the panelists have mentioned, but the real cooperation was seen around the economic pillar of this free and open Indo-Pacific. Like if you look at the actual statement between US and Japan on the shared vision of free and open Indo-Pacific, it's actually the economic vision around energy, digital connectivity, and infrastructure. And also, I think that one of the first speeches around the Indo-Pacific that came from the United States also was from the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on the economic vision of FOIP. So I would say that FOIP is actually more of an economic vision, and which is tied with security and strategic purpose and concerns. But it's just the concept itself is supposed to be inclusive. Even Japan is expressing this inclusiveness and even saying that eventually China can join on this concept if it can confirm with the rules. It's more of this idea of trying to address these areas of governance gaps, and also the need for the development of multilateral trade agreements, and also a construct to keep the United States glued to the region under this construct. And by doing so, kind of push back on China's military and assertive activities in the region through a rules-based order. So I think probably push back a little bit on the security dimension of the.
Yeah, I'm going to move to. Thank you very much, Yuka, and I, fully agree with you. I think that this is sometimes, and often actually, a misperception of not just Japan's FOIP, but I think a lot of Indo-Pacific approaches writ large. And I think sometimes that narrative, I think, is pushed out because it's convenient for some countries that I think would like to sell the Indo-Pacific concept as a sort of a containment strategy against China. But as you said, Japan, and not only Japan, but I think a lot of other countries, when they look at this region, are very much focused on the economic leg, the trade leg, the infrastructure leg. So I think there's evolving approaches to this region, and security is an important point. I mean, I don't think any of us would deny that. But to say that that's the driver, I also would say I would also agree to kind of push back on that. Emi Tendu, I think you had a point.
Jonathan, I think one of the things that I wanted to come out of the question that you raised was how are actually countries trying to address the security dilemma, which is in a sense a part of their existence in the geography that they figure in. And let me try to respond to this query of yours by citing a couple of examples. I think this is something which is clearly dependent upon the size of the country and the amount of weightage it has in regional relations. If you look at countries like Sri Lanka and Maldives in the Indian Ocean, small countries, completely hemmed in by the rush of investments that they have been receiving from China. And it's been so overwhelming that they are really not in a position to make choices, because for them, it's kind of a quid pro quo right from the beginning. But if you shift this narrative further eastward and you look at a country like Indonesia, for example, well, Indonesia has also been caught in the middle, forced in a position to make choices, but because of its size and the weightage that it has in the regional affairs, it still has a certain degree of flexibility. It can afford to make that choice on a case-by-case basis. So I think as we go ahead in the Indo-Pacific, this is a pattern which is going to emerge. Middle powers, bigger powers, powers with more capacity and institutions will be in a better position to hedge, will be in a better positions to decisively drive trade and economic relations with multiple engagements with major powers. But when it comes to the smaller powers, we will see more and more of them taking sides or being forced to take sides. And that's where I go back to my earlier iteration. A forum like the WTO, a forum like the ADB, or institutions like World Bank, they remain absolutely vital.
Okay, that's great, Dan, please, quite briefly, if you can, because I would like to get to the audience questions after this. Sorry, you're on mute, Dan.
One of the things that I think hasn't been mentioned is the idea of balancing. And balancing does actually mean balancing. So you may wish to both partner economically and balance against insecurity spheres. And so the choice is not necessarily either or, but in terms of entirely, but in terms of in which sector. And I guess the other thing which is really important is that as we've moved into the new digital age, the concept of national security exceptions, which is in the WTO agreement, which is geared towards nuclear war, active war, emergencies, that language no longer works. We have the cybersecurity risks are continual, and they're also oftentimes of a much smaller nature. So we have to actually figure out how to craft a security exception that allows trade to go on. So that, I think, is the critical factor there.
Oh, thank you so much. This was a great round of insights. I think we could have kind of gone on for a while. There's a lot of other questions actually on my mind that we'll have to table for the next discussion.